afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today for the CCOVI Lecture Series. Dr. Lester Kwong will be entertaining us this afternoon with his update on his research. Lester obtained his PhD in economics with specialization in game theory and industrial organization from the University of British Columbia in 2005. He's currently a faculty member in the Department of Economics from the Faculty of Business here at Brock. And as of 2010, he also became a fellow of our Research Institute of CCOVI. His research interests are in nonlinear pricing, multi-dimensional screening problems, information structures and optimal auctions, and pricing strategies with applications to the wine market. You can tell I'm not a business researcher, I'm not familiar with your terms. His research has appeared in journals such as the Canadian Journal of Economics, the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics, and the Journal of Wine Economics. He's also presented his work at a number of conferences, including the Canadian Economic Theory Conference, the Canadian Economics Association annual meetings, and the American Association of Wine Economists annual meetings. And today, Lester will speak to us about the pricing of organic wines.
Thank you. All right, so thank you for coming to my talk. The title of this talk suggests pricing of organic wines. So as we probably all are aware of, the size of the organic products market in Canada or in the worldwide, as a matter of fact, has been growing quite drastically over the last decade or so. Some estimates that I've obtained recently goes back to 2006. It was estimated that the Canadian organic market was in size of about $2 billion. In 2010, it is estimated to be about $3.8 billion, and is projected to be in 2015 all the way up to $8.5 billion. Now, this size of this market, a small fraction of it is dedicated to the beverages market, for example, which has seen similar growth. And as a matter of fact, in a lot of the retail environment for the wine market in particular, has devoted a lot of attention into pointing this fact out or this feature out regarding these wines. So, for example, a very prominent online retailer, the Wine Library, located out in New Jersey, if you simply type in up here, you see the little hand on the icon there. If you simply type in up there organic wine, it brings you to this page indicating, some information providing you with regards to what wineries actually use organic grapes in the process of production, a list of alternatives, and so on and so forth. Another large online retailers such as J.J. Buckley out from Oakland, California, also associated with one of the largest online wine auction markets, the Wine Commune, has listed, I guess you can't really see, but down here somewhere it says organic wine as one of its tabs for which you can point out, and it would actually just give you the results of, I suppose, its inventory that's in stock, which is certified organic. Something a little closer to home would be our LCBO bi-weekly catalog, and here I'm not trying to point out the wines of the NATO, but rather, as you will see on the side here, it has a sort of feature which deals with green scene, the green scene in the wine industry, dealing with eco-friendly wineries. Okay, so this goes back to April 17th of 2010. And inside this little feature, as you can see in these bi-weekly catalog that the LCBO puts out, or the vintages branch of the LCBO, it has, for example, these inserts within the catalog itself that describes what the actual, the organic wine industry is about. It does a lot of this introduction and so on and so forth. And in the event that it is not actually doing a feature on organic wines, in the catalog itself, so here I just pulled up one from very recent, February 19, 2011. As you can see, for the listing in this catalog for Lantera Syrah 2007, it lists specifically that it is in fact an organic product, so that consumers, if you were reading through this catalog, you would know, or you would be able to identify what is in fact organic and what is not. So from an economics perspective, when we're dealing with these products and this distinction that we have in the market space, in this product group, some important questions that arise is, well, what do we know about the pricing of these commodities? And in a paper that's forthcoming by Galnes and Brandt from UCLA, written, actually it was around 2008 when this empirical study came out as a working paper, they noticed that there's this price premium puzzle in the organic wines market. So what exactly is this price premium puzzle? Well, they noted that if a wine was produced using organic grapes as opposed to a conventionally grown wine, you would see a price premium attached in the wine market of roughly 13%. So you can command a higher price in the final goods market as a result of having this organic attribute attached to the wine. However, this is for just wines grown using organic grapes. However, the moment you advertise it as such, the moment you slap the label on and say, this wine is in fact certified organic, there's a 20% price discount on this. So you actually have to pay a price penalty as a result of letting this information go into the market. And this is why precisely it is a puzzle. So let's break down the puzzle a little bit, try and understand what's going on. From a winemaker's perspective, or from a winery's perspective for that matter, the choice is actually very simple, right? Going into making this product, you can choose to adopt conventional grapes, otherwise use organic grapes in the process of production. And whatever grapes or whatever means you use to grow these grapes, it would make the corresponding wine. And from these two wines then, implicitly, what we can do is we can assess its quality, okay? Whether through tastings or through expert opinion or whatever measures we want to go through, but in either case, we go through some sort of quality assessment to see what we actually think about this wine. And correspondingly, we can derive, for example, what we can call QO, which means organic. Okay? So the O stands for organic there. Quality QO would denote the quality level of an organic wine, and QC here would denote the quality level of conventional wine. If we just simplify the whole problem and think of this as a numerical measure. So for example, it's a wine rating, an 80 versus a 90.1, for example. And the implication that we have here as a result of a price premium given to organic wine is that one would suspect that the quality of an organic wine exceeds that of the quality of a conventional wine. Okay. So here, if it is in fact the case that the quality of the organic wine exceeds that of the conventional wine, this implies and implicitly this price premium that consumers are willing to pay as a result of this. This is, of course, under the assumption that consumers actually care about quality. The higher the quality, the more I'm willing to pay for it. And, of course, in a survey in 2003 by A.C. Nielsen, summarized here in a study by Everidge, some of the reasons why consumers actually purchase organic products, 11% of the respondents of the survey suggested that it is, in fact, due to a better quality. Okay, so this is quite consistent within this framework. So as an example then, we go into the Pauillac region of Bordeaux. Here we have two chateaus, Chateau d'Armagnac and Pontet-Canet. Both are fifth gross, so they're classified the same. The difference is, the one on the left is a conventionally grown chateau. Grapes were conventionally grown, and Pontet-Canet is actually an organic property. So just grabbing some points and data from the 2005 vintage. Here, this is the Rob Parker scores from barrel samples of the 2005 vintage. It was reported that d'Armagnac has a 90 to 93 range, and Pontet-Canet has a 93 to 95 range. And using data from the LCBO on the futures market, when this wine was first released, you can see that there is in fact a very drastic difference in price as a result. Okay? So the d'Armagnac demanded $62.50 from the LCBO, whereas Pontet-Canet demanded $127. That's 100% increase in price as a result of this. Now, of course, there's a number of reasons why this may be it, right? Here we can see clearly the organic property, Pontet-Canet, qualitatively speaking, from the perspective of Robert Parker, is in fact a higher quality. Now, is this higher quality as a result of it being organic, or is it higher quality as a result of other things? Okay? So we need to control for that. So another way of thinking about this is if we introduce another property from Pauillac, also another fifth growth. So this would be Grand Puy de Coste. Okay, another fifth growth with the exact same barrel scores from Robert Parker from the same vintage. The release price on futures through the LCBO was in fact $114, which is roughly 12%. Okay? So there is in fact holding quality constant. We see, of course this is a very small sample, we see that there is in fact something that's very consistent with the Dalmas and Grant report. There is this 12% price premium that's placed on this, this organic property in the same region. Now, of course, if we were just to simply look at all of these labels, when you go through the store and you were to pick up these bottles itself, on the labels themselves you would not be able to identify that it is in fact organic. It's not labeled as such. But this is not to say that this information is not out there. For example, if you actually do go to Viticulture's website, you will see all this text, and of course you can't read it, nor can I especially. It says here, carefully tended vineyard, respecting the vines, and in this blurb underneath, respecting the vines, it talks about being organic. So this information is actually out there for those consumers who are dedicated to finding out more information regarding this. In a more recent article in Decanter magazine from the UK, January 10th, 2011, it was noted specifically that Viticulture will make no outward sign on the label, either of being organic or biodynamic. And in fact, the director of the Chateau says, the Chateau who claim to practice organic viticulture without applying for certification or often just paying lip service to it simply for marketing reasons. This is not just the only example out there. There's many examples of similar wines of statute that are in fact doing the exact same thing. For example, Joseph Phelps Insignia from Napa Valley. This is a very highly regarded wine, often scoring in 95s and above from Parker. And in fact, if you actually go to the website, not only is there a picture of Joseph Phelps, along with these sheep that are grazing, but you can see under the tab that says About Us, it talks exactly about biodynamic wines. So for the informed consumer, this information, or for the people who want to be informed, this information is actually out there for us to acquire. Now the biggest problem is then, when we do in fact want to slap this stuff on, this advertisement on there, for example, something very local, Frog Pond Farm. Here you will see roughly around where this icon is. That's where this red emblem, which you can't really read, but it says verified organic. Okay? So it actually states on the label that this wine is verified organic. Or Ontario here, it says here organically grown grapes. Connoisseur here says organically grown grapes as well. The moment that you do advertise this information onto your label, it suggests from the empirical study that I cited earlier that there is in fact a price penalty of approximately 20%. So the question is then, what exactly is driving this price differential? You get a premium as a result of being organic. This must be as a result of, or not must perhaps, but there's a strong reason for us to think from an economics perspective that this is a result of an inferior or a superior product in terms of our quality, but the moment that you let this information out publicly in terms of being common knowledge, you're faced with this price penalty. Okay? So this actually introduced a number of important questions that arise from this study, and namely one of the major ones that I've been striving for the last couple of years to answer is price quality driven for organic wines? Are there reasons other than quality that may actually be driving this price differential in these wine markets? So to break this problem down a little bit further then, we talk about the decision variables facing the wineries. For a winery, through the whole process of production, they have to decide on what way they want to go in terms of growing their grapes. Do they want to grow it conventionally, or do they want to grow it organically? And second of all, they must also decide whether or not they want to use eco-labels to advertise this product. Okay? Do I want to let the consumers know? And what's the reason? It's potentially an important source of information. This is potentially an important source. Potential because of the following way. Well, it assumes that if you actually do use an eco-label, that the consumer has an opportunity to actually look at the bottle, read it, and say, oh yes, this wine is in fact made of organically grown grapes. However, that may not always be true. For example, if I was a consumer in the vintages market through the LCBO, and I'm buying through the Classics catalog, there is in fact no avenue for me to actually go and test them and see exactly what is listed on the label. So as a result, I must have to rely on these listed catalogs that's printed by the LCBO online or through printed mail. And here you will see, for example, Frog's Leap Rutherford, Cabernet Sauvignon. It states here that it is in fact, the second sentence there, the team at Frog's Leap use organic fertilizers and encourage blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is in fact an organically grown wine, and even though we don't see much on the label itself, it is noted within the note that's provided by the retailer that this is in fact organic. However, the problem is, and I say from the previous slide that this is a potentially good source of information is because the retailer itself may not consistently do so. So for example, if we look in this very same catalog, there are 3 other wines listed. Pavla Street from Paso Robles, and Joseph Phelps, of course we just talked about Insignia, and Romani Conti. These are 3 very famous organically or biodynamically grown wines. And in those notes that's provided, these reading notes or else supplementary information provided by the LCBO, no mention of its organic status is noted. So that's why it's important. But lastly, the third sort of problem that each of these wineries have to face then, upon making their decision of whether or not to grow these things organically, whether or not to use an eco-label to advertise the product, is of course lastly, what price do I need to charge? Okay, what price can I actually charge and demand in order for my wine to sell in the market? Okay, so that's from the winery's perspective. How about for consumers? Well, consumers first and foremost, they have to get their priorities straight. They need to figure out for themselves what types of consumers they are. Do I want to be an organic consumer, or do I want to be just a conventional one? Or do I really care about these 2 products, for that matter? And second of all, the issue that they need to, well, the sort of problem that they know they're faced with is, in order for them to obtain a higher quality product, they must necessarily be willing to pay a higher price for it. There is, in fact, a higher willingness to pay on the assumption that quality is, in fact, a desirable attribute from a consumer's perspective. So you're out there, I want to get a bottle of wine simply because I want to get drunk. The quality of it doesn't matter, then of course, you can just buy whatever, right? It doesn't matter in terms of the qualitative level of the wine. But if you were actually demanding a higher quality, it is generally assumed that you're willing to actually pay for it from that perspective. However, the problem is, often when you go out into the marketplace, the higher the price does not necessarily imply a higher quality. So there's an informational problem here that needs to be observed from, or that needs to be solved from each of these consumers' perspective. So as a result of reading this or observing this price premium puzzle that I noted earlier, 2 important questions arise. The first is it possible for eco-labels itself to be used as a signal of quality to wine consumers? Okay? What role does this label actually play from an informational perspective with regards to the qualitative level of the wine? And secondly, what implications does a group of devoted organic consumers have on, for example, the pricing equilibrium of the model and the informational role of eco-labels? So these are the 2 problems that I've spent the last couple of years trying to solve, and in fact I'm still working towards obtaining an answer towards a certain extension. So here I'm going to talk about both of these problems in a little bit more in depth today. So first and foremost then, if we simply look at this study that's produced by the University of California Cooperatives Extension based out of Davis, you'll see that this is a table that represents for us the production cost of Chardonnay in Sonoma County in 2004. And here, sorted by the yield per acre, given by tons per acre, we have the price of growing Chardonnay for conventional versus organic. And as you'll see, the price of growing these grapes organically is in fact a lot higher, or somewhat higher than conventionally grown grapes. There is a cost differential between the 2. It's not like it's free. Okay? It's not cheap either. There is in fact a price difference between the 2. So as a result, if we talk about this problem now, is it possible for firms to use eco-labels to signal to consumers that in fact the quality of the product is superior? One of the requirements that we necessarily must have in an equilibrium then is that consumers must be willing to pay for a premium for these organic wines. And the reason is very simple, going back to the table that we just talked about. If it's more expensive for the firm to do it, the only reason they would do it must be because they're rewarded as a result. If they're not rewarded, there's no reason for them to do it, at least not from a profit perspective. Second equilibrium requirement, and this is actually very intuitive now, is you can derive this condition then that there is in fact some sort of critical cost level, so that if your costs are above this particular level, you use the conventional technology, and if you're below this cost level, you use organic technology. So if it becomes, obviously what this translates to then is basically it says, well, if it's prohibitively expensive for you to be organic, you won't, in an equilibrium, which is fine. And lastly, if such an equilibrium is to exist, and this is a condition now on the technical part of the problem, there must exist some quality level whereby the cost of producing organic grapes, organic wines, is in fact falling. Okay? And I'm just going to explain a little bit in terms of why this is necessarily true. I'm going to do this with the following graph. So here we see a relationship between, on the horizontal axis is quality, and on the vertical axis here would be the cost. Okay? What is the cost? This is the cost of going organic. So meaning what? Meaning, for example, at Q lower bar here, if you are in fact producing this quality level of wine, if you want to go organic, it's going to cost you exactly this level up here. Make sense? So there's this relationship between quality and the cost of going organic. And this is going back to my very last point in the last slide. It says, if such an equilibrium is to exist, there must be some quality level. So somewhere along that curve, it must be downward sloping. And if it's not, the reason is very simple. If we in fact have a curve that's something similar to this, what do we know? According to the second point that I made in the previous slide, there must be some critical cost for which if it's prohibitively expensive for you to go organic, you won't, and if it's cheaper than that level, you will. So if, for example, C star here represents for us that critical value, the implication is, for all those quality to the right of Q star, the cost level is above that critical value, and so therefore they don't go organic. For those who are cheap enough, who are relatively inexpensive, they will in fact produce organically. So this is going to be the partition, supposedly, that in principle, this is the equilibrium that will be derived if in fact the cost function is like this. However, this is not sustainable as an equilibrium according to the problem. This cannot possibly occur. And the reason is, consumers really are not that stupid. What do I mean by that? Consumers are not stupid. Well, as you can see, if this is in fact what is going on in the marketplace, if all of those wines that are made conventionally are of a high quality, and all those wines that are made organically are of low quality, consumers must be able to recognize this. If they recognize that a conventionally made wine is of a higher quality than that of an organically grown wine, they certainly will not be paying a premium for an organically grown wine. Which then goes back and violates that original point I made. Why would firms grow organic wines? Simply because they must be rewarded with a premium for it. Okay? So this is not sustainable as an equilibrium as a result. Alright, so what does that mean? Well, basically it doesn't really tell us too much, just only because it gives us a necessary condition and not sufficient in terms of the classes of such cost functions permissible to support such an equilibrium, right? And remember, this equilibrium is one where, I'm trying to signal to the consumers that my wine is of a higher quality as a result of it being organic. Remember, the question that we're asking is, under what circumstances or what type of cost functions will we need in order for that to be an equilibrium? Alright, so if the strictly increasing part is not such, going back to the chart then, here I added an additional column under cost differences. So the cost difference between growing these two types of grapes, according to yield, are given in that third or fourth column, sorry. And here we're going to have to do a little bit of a stretch, or perhaps a slight stretch, if we can consider or reinterpret the yield in terms of tons per acre as a proxy for quality. Okay, so if we work on this assumption that the lower your yield per acre, the higher your quality is, then as you can see, the cost of going organic, as your quality increases, that means we're going down, the cost of going organic is in fact going down. The cost difference in that last column is actually decreasing. So in fact, the data out there does not support really an increasing function like the one we just saw, but rather one that's downward sloping, something like this, perhaps. Okay. And given that this is the scenario then, if this is in fact what we're faced with in the marketplace, well, what do? Well, we do the exact same exercise that we went through before. We have this critical cost value, of which we can now partition the quality spectrum. Those to the right of Q star, now these are the people with relatively low cost of going organic. They are the ones, in fact, adopting this organic grapes, and those that are producing on a relatively poor quality, it won't be because it is quite expensive for them to do so. And if that's the case then, what we can do is then, well, we can ask a very simplified problem on the assumption then, and this is of course just a simplification of the problem, but if it's equally likely that individuals are producing any type of quality, then we can come up with some sort of expected quality given that we observe a conventionally grown grape. Okay? So that means, given that we know that this wine is grown conventionally, we know that the quality lies between Q lower bar and Q star, and as a result, if we have a uniform distribution, for example, this is just the average between those 2 points. Okay? And similarly, we can do the same thing for organic wines, and we see that this is the average between the 2 points. Now let's make a further simplification here. Let's assume that this quality spectrum is rated from, let's say, 1 to 100, and whatever that quality is in terms of this number spectrum, that's the price you're willing to pay. Okay? So let's say, for example, 90-point wine you're willing to pay $90, 80-point wine you're willing to pay $80. This is just a simplification, of course. Okay? And if that's the case, we can actually now identify what are called these incentive compatibility constraints in the problem. And this incentive compatibility constraint basically boils down to the following sort of analysis, right? If you were supposed to grow your grapes conventionally, but you didn't. So if you were in this equilibrium supposed to do it because it's relatively expensive for you to do it, but you didn't, what would you actually gain from growing them organically? Well, for one thing, because consumers are working on this assumption that you have a certain partition in the problem, if in fact you were to grow them organically, you would gain a higher price as a result, because now you would be able to fool the consumers in that sense. So that length of the blue line on the bottom represents the gains or incremental gain for someone who's cheating. Okay? Someone who is relatively poor quality but decides to price the commodity high by growing organically. They obtain a higher price, and that gain is represented by the length of that blue line. And if we take that length of the blue line and we put it on the y-axis, you will see that that gain in the blue line actually outweighs the cost of actually doing so, at least for some of those producers. So for example, if we were to draw a line straight up from here, right across, all of these individuals in here, in this quality range, is actually willing to deviate from this equilibrium plan, right? They're willing to say, I'm supposed to grow it conventionally because I have a low quality, but forget about that. I'm going to grow it organically, I'm going to charge a high price, I'm going to fool all these consumers into thinking that I'm actually high quality, and as a result, I reap the benefits of doing so. Okay? The profits of such a firm doing so will exceed that of it just following basically the equilibrium plan. So in this problem, the way that is written down is actually not even an equilibrium, and you can see that despite the fact that we have something that's downward sloping everywhere, the derivation of such an equilibrium is actually a non-trivial process. Okay? But just to illustrate to you what an equilibrium will potentially look like, for example, if the cost structure was something like this, given the way that we've drawn the graph, you will see that the length of the blue line now on the bottom exactly corresponds to the height of C star. And here this partition is in equilibrium because no one is willing to move away from this particular way. Okay? So if you were supposed to grow it conventionally, you will in this problem. If you were supposed to grow it organically, you will. There are no incentives here in this problem for anyone to deviate away from this equilibrium. So in this study then what I've done is I've characterized these conditions for the existence of such an equilibrium in this problem. Okay? So under what conditions will we have this type of equilibrium? Well, certainly we know increasing cost is not going to cut it. And now there's a possible terroir argument for decreasing cost of going organic in the quality dimension. There's a possibility of it because it may require a bit of a stretch, but I was thinking about why would cost be decreasing if you're going organic, the higher your quality level is. Well, one of the aims, I wouldn't say it's standard at the moment for being biodynamically grown wine, one of the aims published by one of the certifying agents is that harvesting should be done by hand. They want to move away from machine harvesting of grapes. And so, presumably, hand harvesting is a lot more expensive than harvesting by machine. So if you imagine a vineyard that's grown on a very steep slope, where machine harvesting is almost impossible to begin with, and if you attach or you associate that with a very high quality level of wine, then for such a wine that's already hand harvesting to begin with, for them to go and be certified biodynamic, there are of course additional costs to it, but that relatively to someone who is not on a steep slope would be a lot less in terms of the cost perspective. The cost of something that's already in place by not having to change an additional dimension as a result it is quite possible that there is, in fact, some sort of decrease in costs for these people. So that's not too much of a stretch in that sense. And of course, this study also suggests then, as a result of this idea of this partitioning of this quality spectrum, is that for market transparency, a finer partition of the quality is actually desirable. The idea of us being able to identify in a finer partition, rather than saying, oh, this is good and this is bad, is a lot more desirable in that sense. And of course, this leads to the idea of a classification system. If we were able to partition the quality spectrum into different classes, now of course, the idea, or the agreement, the mutual agreement among those who are being classified is of course a different idea, quite a different subject of argument, but this does in fact suggest that we should have some sort of classification system in order for us to partition these qualitative features of the wine mix. And of course, it also leads to this idea that there's not enough information that we currently have of the cost of growing organically, especially in relation to quality. Okay? So this data collection process is actually a very desirable thing from a future understanding of, or better understanding of this problem that we have worked out here. Okay? So going back to a slide then that we already had put up, the question, can eco-labels be used as a signal of quality to wine consumers? So we've addressed that with what I just talked about. So the other thing in this, well, if quality is not really the driving force of the price, then there must be something else going on in the market that is. And so as a result, I started looking at this idea that the consumers themselves could be different, rather than this signaling issue where every consumer in the market goes into the marketplace, but they're the same individual from person to person. Here, what happens if we have some sort of heterogeneity in the market in terms of the consumer base? What implications will a group of devoted organic consumers have on the pricing equilibrium and on the informational property of these eco-labels? So if we talk about the consumer base then, we introduce this consumer heterogeneity in a number of different ways. Sources of differentiation could in fact boil down to the relevant product group. The relevant product group in the sense of, well, are consumers really price-driven, or are there some that are organically owning consumers? Okay. What do I mean by organically owning consumer? Well, these are the consumers that only buy organic commodities for one reason or another. Okay. Price-driven consumers, on the other hand, are those that are simply looking for, given two products that are of the same quality, they're looking for the product that's the cheapest, okay, or that's the lowest price. Alternatively, another source of differentiation among consumers could be the knowledge base. Okay? The knowledge base in the sense of, well, are they informed or are they uninformed? What do we mean by informed and uninformed? Very similar to some of those pictures that I put up earlier. If I put up all of these labels to you, and of course, there is a commonality between all of these wines all over the world, and that is they're all organic or biodynamically grown. The problem is you won't find this information on the label. So what is the difference between an informed and an uninformed consumer? An informed consumer then is one who knows, going into the wine shop, picking up a bottle of, let's say, whatever, Insignia, he knows that it's a biodynamically grown wine. An uninformed consumer, on the other hand, is one where if he looks at it, he doesn't see that it's organically labeled, he wouldn't know that it in fact is. So that's the difference between an informed and an uninformed consumer from that perspective. So as a result, we can set up a very simple problem. And this problem is actually, it is in fact very primitive, but the way we want to look at it is, let's define, for example, some willingness to pay. And let's simplify the problem, let's cut it all the way down to its basic, and see whether or not differences in consumer could in fact drive price differences in the market as a result. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce two different types of consumers. Ones that are price-driven again in the same sense, that they just simply buy at the lowest price, given the same quality level, and those that are in fact dedicated to buying organically only. So the superscript here represents for us the two different types of consumers. What I call M, or price-driven consumers, these are our mainstream consumers. Okay, so the M represents here for us the mainstreamers, and the O represents for us the organic consumers. The subscript, on the other hand, represents the type of commodity that they're buying. So for example, as we can see, a mainstream consumer who buys a conventionally grown wine puts or attaches to it the same willingness to pay as a mainstreamer who's buying an organically grown wine. Given that the two wines are of the same quality, it makes no difference to the mainstreamer whether it is in fact conventional or organic. And in fact, it's the same attached value as an organic consumer who places on an organic product. And R here represents for us that reservation price. This is the maximum willingness to pay for these types of consumers. And conversely then, the difference here is that an organic consumer who buys a conventionally grown wine represents or receives from that consumption some willingness to pay of, let's say, K, and K is, for example, negative. Okay? Meaning they will never buy such a wine. Okay? They would not go into the marketplace and buy a conventionally grown wine. So here we're making a distinction between organic consumers versus mainstreamers in the sense that an organic consumer here would never buy a conventional grown wine. They would rather not consume. So therefore the problem is actually very simple. If we break it all down, if you were in fact a price-driven consumer, then if, so here PI represents the price of commodity I, or firm I for that matter, PJ here represents the price that's offered by firm J, so these are the two different wineries involved, and R here represents the maximum willingness to pay of the consumer. If the price that firm I is charging is less than the minimum of price J and the reservation price, then you simply buy from firm I. It's the lowest price in the market. On the other hand, if firm I's price is exactly the same as firm J, it doesn't matter to you who you're buying from. You're basically flipping a coin and just whatever, half and half. On the other hand, if the minimum price that you see in the market between the two firms is actually greater than your reservation price, well, unfortunately, these are the people that go home empty-handed and start complaining about the high prices they see in the market. They basically abstain from the market and not make any purchases at all. Conversely then, if you were an organically only consumer, what difference are we introducing now? Well, if you were informed, you would actually buy the lowest priced organic product, assuming that an organic product does exist in the market. And remember, these are the people that are informed. These are the people that do not require the eco-label to tell them what type of wine they're making. And on the other hand, if you are uninformed, you buy the lowest organic price, or product, with an eco-label. You need to be able to see that in order to buy it. Okay? If you don't see a product with an eco-label, you basically just walk away from the market in all terms. Alright, so what type of a model or problem are we going to set up? Well, let's think about a very simple sort of analysis here. Here, let's assume that we have the following scenario. You have a number of these firms and they simultaneously choose what type of production technology they want to adopt, whether it's conventional or organic. Second of all, their technological choices, let's assume that's observed by the firms. So if I look across the street, I can see he's growing organically, and so on and so forth. The firms, on the other hand, also must simultaneously choose whether or not to use an eco-label or not, and at the same time must also decide on what price to charge for the commodity. That is made available now to the consumers. The consumers can see the contents of the label as well as the price they're going to pay for this commodity. And of course, based on that decision alone, we're going to decide what commodity here to buy. Okay? And remember here, what we've done is we've abstracted from the quality dimension of the problem. Here, we looked at the quality in the previous problem, but now what we're going to say is, let's assume that these two products are the same quality. What is going to actually drive the differences in the market here? Okay? Lastly, then the market clears by the consumers making the purchasing decisions and the firms actually making the sale through the retailer, for example. Well, the most important thing we want to bring out here, or I want to point out here, is, well, is there a strategic role of eco-labels in this problem? And unfortunately, the answer is no, because it's irrelevant. Okay? The question is, who cares? Who cares about these eco-labels? Well, if we go back into the problem of consumer heterogeneity, who are the individuals that actually do care about the eco-labels? The only people that actually do place an emphasis on it are the uninformed organic-only consumers. And if the uninformed organic consumers are the ones that, in fact, the organic firms are targeting, I should put an eco-label on everything I sell. There's no reason for me not to. Okay? And I'm going to get back to this point at the end of the talk. Okay? This is a very important point that I'm going to bring up to you later. So for the moment, the strategic role of equal labels is completely irrelevant. Okay? So that's why we can just ignore that strategic consideration. Turns out then the following is necessarily true, and this is actually not a very surprising economic result from economics itself. That is, in a symmetric choice outcome, on the assumption that two firms, remember at the beginning of the problem, they're deciding whether or not they want to grow things conventionally or organically. If they both decide to grow things conventionally, or if they both choose to go organically, the outcome, if both firms choose the same production technology, then there is in fact only a unique equilibrium to the pricing problem. That is, they must make zero profits. That's not a very surprising result in the sense that, well, if nothing distinguishes me from you, quality is the same, our growing technique is the same, it's just a coin toss for the consumer every time he looks at the two products from us, I don't have a pricing advantage over you. If I price it at, let's say for example my costs are $5 per bottle in production, I charge you $10 for the process or for this wine, what's preventing my competitor from charging you $9? And if he charges you $9, that consumer, because he is price driven, will never buy from me who's charging $10. So as a result, that cannot be sustainable as an equilibrium. That person or that firm charging $10 will necessarily decide, oh wait, that can't happen, I'm going to charge $9. Okay? So they match prices as a result. But of course, if that's the same, what's preventing the firm from charging $8? Nothing. And as a result, this price competition drives the price all the way down to cost, and at the end, our equilibrium here suggests that firms are in fact looking at a zero profit outcome. That's not very desirable from the firm's perspective, perhaps. So then, of course, we have to look at the asymmetric choice problem. The question is then, what happens if one of these firms decide to produce initially, right? So at the initial choice step, what happens if one firm decides to grow things conventionally and the other starts to grow these wines organically? Well, it turns out that the equilibrium is completely different, and it's actually a lot more desirable. So for this problem, let's just assume the y-axis here, pi here, represents for us profits. So the y-axis here represents for us profits for the firm 2, and firm 2 is the firm that's growing things organically. The x-axis here represents for us some sort of price measure. Okay? So C here is the cost of the production. R, remember, that's the maximum willingness to pay of the consumer. And let's just arbitrarily fix, for example, the firm that price that firm 1 is charging. Okay, so firm 1 is the one that's growing things conventionally. Let's suppose firm 1 charges some price P1. Okay? We're not saying that he will, but if in the event that he does charge that price, what happens to the profits for this firm? Well, if the organic firm charges a price that's strictly below, okay, remember this is the organic firm we're talking about, so if the organic firm charges a price that's strictly below the price of firm 1, who will buy from him? Well, certainly all of the organic consumers will, and the price-driven consumers as well, because he has the lower priced product. So as a result of this, in the event that the price of the organic firm is lower than the conventional firm, we have this sort of profit function that looks like this. Okay? So as the price that you charge increases of firm 2, so if firm 2's price is actually, say something like this height would represent for us the profits. The higher the price, the higher the profits. Not surprisingly. And these profits are increasing so long as the price you charge is less than the price of your competitor. The moment that your price is exactly equal to your competitor's price, what happens? Well, the moment that your price is exactly equal to your competitor's price, you maintain all of the people who are buying organically only, because of course the competition is a conventional only. There's no switch of those consumers. However, those mainstream consumers, those individuals that are price-driven, the individuals that are indifferent between your technology you've chosen, all of a sudden they start flipping a coin. Okay, so there's a coin toss now. As a result, even though your profits are increasing, the moment that it's equal, it drops a bit, because you lose out on some of these consumers. And what happens then is the moment that you start charging more than your competition, well, the moment that you all of a sudden are strictly larger, as long as your price is strictly larger than your competitors now, all of those price-driven consumers are out of your market, they're not buying from you, and the only ones you have remaining, which maintains your profits at a high level, or at a positive level anyways, are those that are buying organic only. Remember, this is your captive market. Right? these are the consumers that are only buying organic. And if you're the only firm in the market that's selling organic, they will stick to you regardless. So how much profits can you make? Well, so long as your price is above your competitors, this is what your profit looks like. Okay? So it's increasing up until, of course, you hit the reservation price of the consumer. The moment you go above the reservation price of the consumer, oops, your profits go to zero. No one's buying anything from you. Okay? You're just putting an expensive bottle of organic wine on the shelves, and no one is buying. All right, so if that's the case, the question that we're asking now then is, this is actually very important, right? Remember, if the two firms were growing, or if the two firms were actually using the same technology, nothing distinguishes between the two firms. And if that's the case, again, this price competition drives the market price all the way down to the cost. In the event that the choice between the two firms is not the same, will we actually have a lowest price in the market? Will there be the lowest possible price ever charged by any one of these firms? And the answer is yes. And that's because, remember that very last dot there, the black dot here, right at the end. This represents for us the profits that you obtain from those consumers who are only buying organic commodities, and you're actually charging their maximum willingness to pay. Right? So this is an organic-only consumer for this quality level of wine. I'm only willing to pay $25, and you're actually charging them $25. This represents for us the maximum amount of profits you can extract from the captive market. And if that's the case, if that height represents for us the maximum profits, if we draw a line across, you will see, remember, this upward sloping line that we have here represents for us a very optimistic scenario. That optimistic scenario is the event that your price is actually lower than your competitors. So if this is the maximum profits I can earn if I just monopolize on my captive market, there's no reason for me to charge below this price. Charging anything below that price, from an economics perspective, from a profit maximization perspective, is not rationalizable. You should not be charging a price below P lower bar, because charging a price below there simply just throwing away your own profits. Okay? The best case scenario is, of course, you get the whole market at a price in between. Okay? But this determines for us now this lowest price in the market, which is very important, because as you can see, if P lower bar is the lowest price charged by firm 2, P lower bar is certainly larger than C, which means now all of a sudden there are in fact positive profits to be had in this problem. So in fact this P lower bar, and as a competitor then, a conventional firm, although we haven't talked about it here, a conventional firm would look at this problem in exactly the same way, and you would say, oh, I know my competitor is not charging below P lower bar, so if I'm actually competing in terms of price with my competitor, there's no reason for me to do so either. So as a result, P lower bar becomes the lowest price in the market, and the important thing is that it's above cost. Therefore, positive profits prevail in this particular problem. So without going into too much more technical detail, the equilibrium here that we characterize then represents for us the following way. There is in fact just two equilibriums to be had. And both of these equilibrium driven solely because profits are positive in the event that we choose different ways, we choose different paths for growing our wine. Because profits are positive, they must represent for us the only equilibrium path. There's no reason for any firm to go down a path where profits are driven down to zero. And so basically all this is saying is, in equilibrium, we will in fact have one firm adopting the conventional strategy and one firm adopting the organic strategy. But more importantly, the price here is not going to be a deterministic thing. It's in fact going to be a stochastic problem. There's going to be a distribution of prices in the market, very much like what we actually do observe in the real world. But in particular then, drawing from the equilibrium conditions that we impose, in equilibrium what will necessarily happen is the distribution of prices for a conventionally grown wine will actually exceed, or at least be at least as large as, the distribution of prices for organically grown wines. And this, from a statistical perspective, actually has important implications. Namely, this is what we call first-order stochastic dominance. First-order stochastic dominance has a further implication, or as a result of that, it tells us very much something that we do want to acquire from this problem, is that the expected price of an organic wine will definitely exceed the expected price of a conventionally grown wine. And of course, this is on average. Okay? This is not every organic wine will exceed the price of a conventionally grown wine. But in fact, on average, this is what we will expect out of this market. So some final remarks that I want to make then. The equilibrium that we've derived here in this problem consists of asymmetric strategies, that is one firm going organic, one firm growing conventionally grown wines, given that even though they're ex ante symmetric. Okay? So even though they start off being symmetric, they will in fact choose the asymmetric path. And the reason they do so is because this equilibrium path avoids the sort of undesirable outcome from the firm's perspective of zero profits. They actually do maintain some sort of positive profit from this problem. We of course also have this price dispersion property in equilibrium with on average higher prices for organic wines. And lastly, consumer informativeness is important in this current setting. Okay? And as I mentioned earlier, I was going to come back to this particular point. This leads us to now a future direction. Okay? What are some of the conditions necessary for us to impose into the problem then in order for eco-labels to actually have a strategic effect? Because that's very important. We do observe as a result, if we go out into the marketplace, we do in fact observe organic wines with and without these labels. Okay? The question is why? Why do we actually see that? So we therefore need to be able to model the usage of eco-labels in a strategic way. And one way that we can actually do that, and this is precisely what I'm working on at the moment, one way we can do this is to introduce what we call, or what I call, naive, conventional-only consumers. These are your anti-organic consumers into the market. And from this chart that I cut out from the study, the Canadian organic consumers in 2000, there is in fact this 26% of consumers in the marketplace that never purchase organic products. Okay? Now there's a reason, there may be a reason one way or another, right? You may say, I talk to some of my colleagues or my friends and they say, well, I would never buy an organic apple because it's got holes in it. Right? Well, their belief is that it's an inferior product. That may or may not be true, I'm not sure. Right? But I'm just saying, if we in fact do introduce these consumers in the market that only buy conventional products and not organic, and they're naive in what sense? Naive in a very simple sense, in the sense that if I don't see an eco-label, I'm going to assume it's conventional. Okay? Well, if that's the case, all of a sudden, you may actually have organic consumers, people like, for example, Insignia, Joseph Phelps, that produce organic wines, and they may say, well, I don't actually want to put an eco-label on there. I don't want to discourage these people from actually participating in the market. Now, if that market size is sufficiently large, you can see, obviously, there are economic implications from that sense. So that's one way we can introduce the strategic effect. And of course, it begs the question then, if we can actually get such an environment from a modeling perspective, if in fact these eco-labels do have a strategic effect, then we must have to examine the social cost of certification. Because if organic consumers are actually commanding, or organic commodities are actually commanding a higher price, there's incentives for firms which are socially undesirable from an economics perspective to be going organic, that they will. And so as a result, we may be able to study, based on the cost of certification perhaps, who actually gets to go organic and who doesn't. Okay? And so that basically wraps up the talk today. Thank you.
For some questions from the audience and also from our online speakers. Do we have anything right up online? Okay. Anything from the group here? Amy, could you come up and speak into the mic?
Okay, first of all, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just wanted to talk about the quality and higher quality, lower quality. What do you mean? How would you define quality?
That is actually so the question is how can we define, or how do I define quality? So quality is actually a very touchy subject, of course, in the wine industry as well. And I actually don't have a good answer for that because I'm not sure exactly how we define quality. Quality means a lot of different things for a lot of people. And for us to be able to summarize it like a lot of the wine critics do, for example, you drink a wine, you taste it, and its bouquet looks like this, its color looks like this, its finish is this, and we summarize into a numerical score. That numerical score, in principle, represents price and quality. But of course, unless we interpret the different dimensions that went into calculating the score identically, that score is completely meaningless from my perspective. Okay? So as a result, the answer is I'm not sure. Right? And there is in fact no clear-cut way of answering that question. That is in fact another interesting question that I have been studying for the last little while in terms of how do we actually assess quality when in fact the attributes that determine quality for us is in fact multidimensional. It's not like, oh, it's blah, blah, blah. Right? And in fact, if you break it down, like for some of these critics that do, in the wine market, for example, the bouquet is worth 5 marks. I don't exactly know what the breakdown is, but the finish is worth 5 marks, and so on and so forth. If it breaks down into this sort of additive structure, that has actually very important implications, because if my color isn't, or if my finish isn't quite good enough, I can get an extra mark if I just make it darker, for example. Right? I can trade off those marks in a perfectly substitutable way. Okay? So maybe I have food coloring, I can get it a little bit darker. Parker's going to like it a little bit more, but I don't have to go invest in so much to make the finish a bit longer or something like that. Right? So there's this substitutability implicit in the scoring structure of these wines. The question obviously is then how do we actually break down quality? Well, we need to have the answer is I'm not sure.
That's why I asked.
It'll be fair for me to say.
Thank you. This is a very interesting paper. It was focused on a search theory and modeled it as gain, as opposed to the conventional way of doing it, like looking at, say, elasticities and bringing in the influence of demand. I think that the quality issue that was just raised is a very important one. I don't think we can assume that Q of 0, that the quality of organic is necessarily higher than the quality of conventional, because the whole issue of terroir, which is the scarcity of certain, it may not apply to California, where there are huge tracts of, in Napa Valley, but there are small segments of it's a segmented market where producers trade, by which I mean they monopolize on the basis of their particular plots of land, particular terroir. So very small production scale, 200 boxes, and then they can charge a higher price. Sure. So there is that scarcity element associated with land, which is scarce. And so that scarcity dimension is not quite captured in your quality index. And it seems to me that you want to allow some recognition for that. My second question is that your cost functions are, I hope they're based on some empirical evidence, because it seems to me you have economies of scale, because you have C going down as Q goes up. Again, this may be true if you're using highly mechanized production, but my understanding of organics is that it is very much more labor intensive, because you're substituting labor for pesticides and substituting care for machinery. So it's that's not going to give you that nice downward sloping cost function. Okay. 2 questions.
So I remember the second question first, so I'll answer that one. So the second question was, with the cost function, or what are the assumptions that went into the cost function being downward sloping? And the answer is, well, that's just one example that I just tossed up. The whole purpose of that discussion was to simply say you cannot possibly have a cost function that's increasing everywhere for this property that using equilabels to signal quality as an equilibrium phenomenon. So whether or not the cost function is actually downward sloping or not, I'm not sure. Right? And personally, that's a problem in terms of application of the model. But from the modeling perspective, the purpose was to derive the conditions on the cost functions necessary to derive that as an equilibrium phenomenon. Okay? Now, whether they can be decreasing everywhere, whether they can be concave everywhere, convex everywhere, it can be increasing, decreasing, doesn't really matter. Okay? And the question or the idea is that given what the cost function is, can you actually derive that as an equilibrium? And those are the conditions that are derived in the problem. So that was just an illustration that we tossed up into the slides, or into the presentation, sorry. And regarding to the first question, which is this whole scarcity and whether or not scarcity plays a role in terms of quality. So I think that question is actually very similar to the first question that was asked by the other audience member with regards to what we call quality. Because I think in the wine market, despite the fact that you're selling terroir, right, you can be selling a plot of land that's very small, you have limited production like these caps from California, for example. But the problem is, as a wine consumer, unless I'm only buying these wines for the purpose of collecting or being able to say, you know, I have this wine in my cellar, without actually drinking it or without actually buying it for the reasons of quality, I don't think scarcity actually matters too much. Right? Because scarcity, at the end of the day, is completely irrelevant unless it gives you qualitative characteristics which are not obtainable elsewhere. So the terroir argument is actually, you know, very much similar to the question previous. How do we define quality? And perhaps, you know, this plot of land gives you a bit of cinnamon. I don't know. And that's a desirable trait. And if that's a desirable trait that elevates quality, you're going to have to pay for it as a result. Okay? And so all of these differences, I don't think that it's a matter of the scarcity of the supply in the sense of its determination of quality. Right? I don't think there's a correlation there in that sense.